The aim of the event is to explore some of the key themes of COP27 climate conference, which is starting next week in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Today we have three speakers: Andrew Norton, former director of the International Institute for Environment and Development. Then we have the second speaker, Jessica Omukuti. She's based at the Institute of Science, Innovation and Technology, and she's a research fellow for the Oxford Net Zero Initiative. And then we have Tom Tanner, director of the SOAS Center for Development, Environment and Policy, which is a center within the Department of Development Studies. I would like to let you know that we are recording this event, and that if you have any questions for the speakers, please save your questions for after the initial interventions. We will have a discussion session at the end of the three presentations then. The interventions will be 10-12 minutes long. And so now I can introduce the first speaker. So the first speaker today will be Andrew Norton. I'm going to introduce you, Andrew. Andrew is an applied anthropologist who was the director of the International Institute for Environment and Development until September of this year. Prior to that, he was director of research at ODI and has worked as a lead social scientist in the World Bank and DFID. At IIED, he worked with the team supporting the least developed country negotiating group at the climate negotiations, and while at the World Bank, he co-led the work program on the social dimensions of climate change. And this contribution today draws on that experience to discuss some of the key financing challenges facing the COP27 meeting and the UNFCCC process going forward. So Andy, you have 10-12 minutes maximum, and I will notify you when there are 2 minutes left. So around after 10 minutes from the start of your presentation. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Giuseppina, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, as you were saying, I'm going to be speaking about some of the issues around finance, which increasingly seems to be kind of the key issue across the full spectrum of mitigation, adaptation and loss and damage, the full spectrum of climate action, at least in the UNFCCC. And I'm going to be speaking to the specific issues in particular around public climate finance, the role of aid, and some of the details like the balance of loans versus grants within that play into climate justice arguments. On the whole, it's quite a worrying picture, and it could indeed blow up badly at the COP. Hopefully it won't. So as a quick bit of background, let me start with the fabled 100 billion. This was a commitment made by OECD countries to the majority world of low and middle income countries, originally in 2009 at Copenhagen, reiterated at Paris in 2015. It was supposed to be hit in 2020. The OECD figures came out this year for 2020 and showed a substantial shortfall, 83 billion for 2020. So still not close. Having said that, the debate about the 100 billion is in many ways a bit odd. It was a kind of a political target without any real science or needs basis to the figure. And there are lots of issues of measurement and counting, and these figures are also contested. The UK COP presidency at Glasgow developed a delivery plan which anticipated the 100 billion would be hit in 2023, which matches the OECD projections, but many civil society actors think the real figures are lower and contest that. So where are we on climate finance? What are some of the major issues and how are they going? Well, beyond 2025, that 100 billion is for the 5 years 2020 to 2025. There will be a need for a new target. That won't be set at COP27, that's expected in 2024. The least developed countries are arguing that that should be science and needs-based. So there will be a really important discussion around that, which will be starting at Sharm el-Sheikh, but will not close. one really important commitment from Glasgow at COP26, which I think was very welcome, was to double adaptation finance by 2025 against 2019 levels. That's important because it drives a continuing rise in the proportion of climate finance going to adaptation, which has been rising. It rose quite substantially between 2019 and 2020 to reach 34%. But that matters from a climate justice perspective because adaptation finance tends to go to the poorest countries more. Whereas if you're focusing on mitigation, you're going to logically focus on the big emitters, which are going to be large middle income countries. But there are lots of issues to be ironed out, particularly around transparency. All the donors, particularly the bilateral donors, kind of count their contributions in different ways. The data isn't always clear. So it's very hard for recipient countries to know reliably what the actual progress is on that target. But, you know, there are efforts being made to improve that. So hopefully, I think there is some hope that we'll get to a better place on that. And that target may be also attainable, which would be good. And then there were a range of specific commitments at Glasgow, some of which were quite important and got a lot of attention. I'm thinking particularly of the Just Energy Transition Programme in South Africa, which was announced at COP26 with a sort of notional 8.5 billion of funding to support basically the accelerated retirement of coal power, in particular within South Africa. I'll come back to that in a minute. There are some interesting issues around that. That wasn't closed then. There's an expectation or a hope that the deal will be kind of closed formally at COP27. So that's one to watch out for. There was also a forest finance pledge of 12 billion, which it was also significant. So what are the key challenges of the moment? Well, there's a huge one in relation to public climate finance right now. This is mostly official development assistance, ODA, aid, and the direction of travel is quite challenging. Reductions in aid volumes are potentially toxic given the failure on the 100 billion. So the UK has just missed the September deadline for its Green Climate Fund, Global Climate Fund contribution, 288 million, and also failed to provide 20 million to the adaptation fund. So that could be an issue unless it's turned around. And the UK is at the moment spending more of its bilateral aid budget in the UK on the resettlement of Ukrainian refugees largely, which is allowed under DAC rules for the first year, than it is spending in poor countries. So obviously that's putting a huge amount of stress on all kinds of drawdowns on the aid budget, including climate finance. I saw today that Rishi Sunak, UK PM, has announced he will go to Sharm el-Sheikh. Originally he said he wouldn't. Hopefully that'll be a positive sign and will encourage some engagement. UK as COP president, if it's not delivering, that's a really big problem. It's not just the specifics, it's also the commitment to double climate finance over this period to 11.6 billion, which was made before COP26, and that also needs to be delivered on. There are problems as well with the US. It's struggling to get things through Senate. It still hasn't delivered 2 billion of the 3 billion promised by Obama to the GCF in 2014, and is coming up with some worrying proposals around, for example, private philanthropic money going to the GCF, which most people think isn't going to work anytime soon. And there are other countries. Sweden, the election also puts an important aid donor on the back foot. It's not all bad news. The recent election in Denmark looks like it didn't look as bad. All of this plays into another big problem, which is the balance between grants and loans. Bilateral aid that I was just discussing is largely grants, overwhelmingly grants. And if that's failing and the gap is being made up by multilateral development banks, then there's going to be a very large loan component of that, which may not, varying degrees of concessionality within that. That matters. The IMF recently estimated that even, I think, before the Ukraine shock, 60% of low-income countries were in debt distress. As of now, 70% of public climate finance is loans, much of it not on particularly concessional terms. And that basically needs to reverse. There are calculations from IIED. If the debt burden of countries isn't going to be made worse by climate finance, it needs to be 70% grants. A few words quickly about how climate finance is now front and centre in mitigation, which I think is a new development. A few years ago, a lot of us were saying that public climate finance should be overwhelmingly geared to adaptation, and that the private sector and private investment should be the bulk of mitigation finance. But these very important just transition partnerships, there's another one expected in the period of Sharm. It may be announced at the G20 for Indonesia. And these are really important for accelerating mitigation. But they include, as you might guess from the just transition framing, substantial amounts of social spending, social policy engagement, community finance, retraining, social protection and so on, that countries are unlikely to want to borrow IBRD on hard loan terms for those. So we also see public climate finance grants and highly concessional becoming very important in the mitigation space, which again increases the pressure on public climate finance. And there is, of course, a general sense in these countries that rich countries should be putting significant grant finance into the energy transitions they need to make in terms of historic responsibility and climate justice. There's obviously a really strong case for that. So where are areas where positive movement might be feasible? Debt forgiveness, that will come up at Sharm. Not clear how much movement there'll be, but there are proposals around debt for climate swaps, whereby countries get portions of their debt written off or brought down against actions they take on climate. And Mia Motley, the PM of Barbados, is making a lot of running also with the Bridgetown agenda, which includes various things more in the multilateral space, special drawing rights and IMF kind of reserve currency, allocating more of that to climate action and to poor countries, and doing a new round. There was a round worth 650 billion last year, but the amounts that have been repurposed for poorer countries by rich countries are disappointing thus far. And also
Andy, you had 10 minutes, sorry.
Okay, great. I'll be really quick. There's also a proposal to work on enabling the MDBs to access more finance by basically changing the rules around how much they can lend against their capital, which could also release significant amounts of money. There's an estimate of $1 trillion around that as a mix of hard and soft loans. So some of the key issues, just really quickly, improving access to climate finance, including the amount that gets to the local level. That's not something I've talked about, but that's hugely important. Improving transparency. Loans versus grants. How can you increase climate finance resource flows while reducing debt burdens at the same time, certainly not increasing them? Tom, I'm sure, will talk to loss and damage finance, which is a really, really critical issue going into Sharm, and I've kind of left that to one side because he's going to be dealing with that. And also keep an eye on these just energy transition programs, which will be really important for global mitigation. And obviously, the global geopolitical environment is challenging at the moment in all kinds of ways in relation to public climate finance, but it's really important to find ways forward on that. And we'll be watching what goes on at Sharm for that. Thank you very much indeed, Juicy.
Thank you, Andy. That was very interesting and a very good overview of the different decisions on financing in COP26 and what we should expect next in COP27. And now we have the second speaker, and I would like to introduce the second speaker, Jessica Omukuti. Jessica is a research fellow on inclusive net zero for the Oxford Net Zero Initiative, and she's based at the Institute of Science, Innovation, Technology. Prior to joining the University of Oxford, she was a research associate at the University of York, working on climate financing of climate change adaptation in developing countries. She has also previously worked at the Green Climate Fund and in NGOs such as Mercy Corps and Care International in sub-Saharan Africa. where she led development and resilience programs in the region. Jessica's contribution today draws on her research critically examining whether and how the net zero concept enables greater equity and justice in climate action by state and non-state actors in emerging economies and developing countries. So Jessica, you have 10, 12 minutes for your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. I think this is the first time I'm speaking without slides, and so I'll just probably tell a story. So this year's COP is quite exciting for me because I get to go back home. I mean, Egypt is a few countries away from Kenya, where which is my home, but it's kind of almost the same. But most importantly, at least I think we're likely to see a change of pace. I've been, this being an African COP, I've been involved in some part, probably even 1% of preparations for the COP27, and we see, I've seen a lot of emphasis on finance, as Andy has said, but also emphasis on implementation. And so the kind of the change in, let's say, tempo or narrative, or the change in narrative is quite interesting, such that we're expecting a bit of emphasis on what happens. We've been planning for adaptation. We've been creating plans and strategies. How do we move forward to implement them? And this theme is really important, particularly in relation to net zero. And so let me talk about my work on net zero and what I've learned over the last maybe year and a half. As you've heard earlier, I started working in development, and then I moved to climate finance, and then I started doing work on net zero. And when I started doing this work, when I first heard about net zero, I was quite skeptical because I thought, why do net zero when you could easily do zero? You could absolutely reduce your emissions, because right now, extreme climate change risks are already extreme for a lot of households and communities. And so going for net zero that holds global warming at 1.5, it just means, in some cases, just wiping out of some communities or some states. Some small island states will probably lose half of their land because of 1.5 degrees of warming by 2050. And even the IPCC report showed that we're kind of losing our chance. We're losing our likelihood of reaching 1.5 by 2050. And so we're supposed to peak by 2030 and then rapidly decrease our emissions at the global level thereafter. But then the IPCC, the Paris Agreement says that developing countries will take a bit longer to peak. So that's kind of the CBDR principle within the Paris Agreement, which says that we need to limit warming to 1.5, but then recognizes that there's a common but differentiated responsibilities and capacities. And this has shaped how I think about net zero. And so we've been working, my colleagues and I have been working to understand what net zero actually means globally, but also what net zero means within the global south, within developing countries. And we've found out that net zero as a framework has implications. There's some equity and justice concerns that net zero does not really address, some pre-existing equity and justice concerns that net zero does not address. But also net zero creates new equity and justice concerns. But then there's a chance to ensure that whatever pathway to net zero, whatever pathway to emission reductions that goes for limiting warming to 1.5 is more equitable, is more just, and supports developing countries to transition in a just way. And at the center of it are issues of financing that Andy mentioned. And so for countries to actually, what we're learning is that for developing countries to transition to net zero, we need to kind of change the narrative, because at the moment, net zero itself is actually seen as a framework that encourages emission reductions. But a lot of developing countries have so the framework itself encourages deep emission reductions, but developing countries have very small emissions. And so there's a time I was reading some NDC targets NDC submissions by some small island states, but also small states in Africa, and they say that some of them are actually net zero on their carbon. Some states will require a bit more carbon space. For example, I like giving examples of countries that are in conflict, just emerging from conflict. And so recovery, reconstruction, and actually development will require a lot of carbon. And when I walk around, I see new buildings still being put up, and I think, well, I mean, if someone from, let's say, Yemen or someone from Somalia came to the UK and saw all these buildings, and they're like, yeah, if I were the president of my own country, I would want these buildings. And so that level of development is still an ambition, and so countries would still want to develop, and that is a right for them. And so net zero itself as a framework should be able to accommodate pathways to development, pathways to green growth, but also pathways to adaptation and resilience. And we're kind of eager to see this come up at the next COP, where we are aware that issues of net zero took kind of center stage at the last COP. We saw a lot of institutions, particularly businesses, make commitments on net zero, and then after that we kind of we saw a lot of concern about whether those commitments were credible and how those commitments were actually going to be achieved. And so we're seeing kind of this story actually just kind of move into this COP, where we'll have discussions about the credibility of commitments that were made in COP26, but also how those commitments are being met, or actually how we can start moving towards implementation of those commitments, and not just by businesses, but also by countries. And here is my concern, as I said earlier, is I'm eager to kind of see how net zero is reframed within an African COP, how net zero is reframed to kind of be much more inclusive to the concerns of emerging economies, emerging markets and developing countries, but also to be much more aware that a 1.5 degree of warming is not something that is ideal. 1.5 degree is, as I said, much more extreme risks, much more costs for adaptation, higher costs for for loss and damage. And so a more inclusive framework should actually be discussed at COP27. But then my worry also is that despite us having those concerns for equity and justice, there'll be a bit more talk kind of focusing on what the private sector could do, or what the private sector can do, as opposed to looking at higher level emphasis on ensuring that the framework itself, but also how it's operationalized, is much more inclusive. One thing we're noticing, though, I hope I'm coherent. Actually, it's really difficult to speak without a set of slides. But yeah, one thing we've found out is so we did a study which we're just wrapping up. We're hoping to have it ready by the end of the week. So we did a study that mapped net zero commitment on net zero commitments by businesses. And so two sets of studies, one that was done by my colleagues who looked at net zero commitments by publicly listed companies that are the 2,000 largest companies globally. So 2,000 of the largest publicly listed companies, according to the Forbes list. And that assessment showed that a few companies, like about two-thirds of companies did not have emission targets. Most of the companies that had targets were mostly from Europe, mostly European, and then a few other developed country companies. Very few companies from Africa and other developing countries or regions. Then we decided, we were quite curious to understand whether there was that very simple, spatial distinction in who was adopting net zero targets and who wasn't. And so we followed up with an assessment that I said we're releasing this week, that looked at whether African companies were setting emission targets or setting net zero targets. And so we reviewed 250 of the largest publicly listed companies according to African Business. So there's a magazine called African Business, and we found that surprisingly, African companies are setting emission targets. And so we've seen a lot of companies set emission targets between 2020 and 2022, which means that there's kind of a, it's like a wave, it's like a feedback loop or whatever, it's a reaction. And so we saw net zero come up as a big agenda in 2021 and 2020, 2021. And then African companies probably responded to that and started setting up their targets. And they're also outlining how they're moving towards net zero. And so the continent itself is already reducing its emission, which is quite commendable because they have contributed very little to emissions so far. Africa is probably the continent that is, as there's people who say that Africa is the continent that is closest to net zero. And so it means that at the global level, some groups that have contributed least to the problem are already contributing towards addressing it. And so what I'm hoping to say is that at COP27, we'll have discussions on how we can embed more justice and equity into conversations on net zero. I'm not sure how much time I have left. I have a minute.
Just ahead 10 minutes, so you have 2 minutes more if you want.
And that's it. And the one thing that maybe I should mention towards the end is, which I should probably have mentioned at the beginning, is that I've been a member of a high-level expert group appointed by the UN office, the UN Secretary General, and our job was to provide recommendations for how businesses that I mentioned had kind of really made a big deal of their net zero commitments at COP26. And so our job was to look at those commitments and provide recommendations on how we can make them much more credible. And one thing we've done over the past few months is consult with a lot of stakeholders, but also to kind of just look much more deeply into what these commitments are being made, what they look like, and what they hope to achieve. And we've tried to embed principles for equity and justice into that. And those will be launched at COP27, but also we're hoping that these will start being translated into standards, but also into kind of being embedded into targets by non-state actors who are, in this case, businesses, cities, and regions. And so we hope to start seeing much more equity represented into net zero commitments post COP27. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was very interesting, and yeah, it's a very fascinating discussion. All the discussion around justice and equity and net zero, and what are the different responsibilities for different countries, looking developing and developed countries in terms of reducing emissions. And we have, as I said before, we have a discussion at the end of the 3 presentations. So now I would like to invite Tom Tanner for his intervention. And Tom Tanner is director of the SOAS Center for Development, Environment and Policy within the Department of Development Studies. Prior to SOAS, he worked with the ODI, IDS in Sussex, UNDP, and DFID. He's an editor of the journal Climate and Development and serves on the expert advisory body of the UN's Race to Resilience initiative. He specializes in building resilience and adaptation to climate change through research, policy, and practice. His commentary today will speak to the impacts and the adaptation side of the climate change response. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Giuseppina, and everyone. Pin myself. Hi, yeah, so I guess I'll start with a story as well, which is that when I was fresh-faced coming into this, the world of the COP back in the early 2000s, it was a similar transition. So it was a move into the adaptation space, the impact space within the UN framework. And I'm seeing similar arguments now. So it was up until COP7 in Marrakesh in 2001, it was seen as a little bit of a distraction from tackling the real root cause of the problem, the mitigation, and that adaptation was perhaps something that was not solvable through international law, that it was a kind of predominantly national and subnational problem. That's where it needs to be tackled, but mainly that it was a distraction. And there's kind of similar discussions now about loss and damage, perhaps not a failure to accept that it is an important third pillar, mitigation, adaptation, and tackling the losses and damages, but the kind of lamenting that it constitutes a policy failure. And our colleague and IPCC author Lisa Schipper posted on Twitter and caused quite a stir by saying that it was very sad that loss and damage was the focus instead of reducing emissions. Not because it was not important, but because it feels like policy failure. And as an adaptation practitioner, she felt like it appears that this is kind of giving up on adaptation, and that loss and damage needs to be seen as part of a combination of solutions. That said, loss and damage has become a real hot topic. It was in Glasgow last year, and it's really been taken on board, particularly by the climate justice movement, as central to what they're pushing and their agendas and what they're expecting from the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh next week. To put it in a bit of context, loss and damage within the UNFCCC, it's looking at the losses and unavoidable damages caused by anthropogenic climate change, so human-caused climate change. We know that obviously there are losses and damages that are caused by climate-related hazards regularly and historically. Obviously, the science of attribution has made that clearer, and we've seen much clearer links between some of the recent major forest fires and the Pakistan floods, with the science supporting these as extraordinary events with a high likelihood that they are have a signal from the human-caused element of climate change. Loss and damage then looks at the biophysical side as well as the human systems. It looks at economic damages, but also non-economic. So a lot of the work has been trying to push the importance of cultural loss, of place attachment, and these kind of things that aren't traded in markets. And it's also defined within the UNFCCC in terms of 3 elements. So it's averting the actions that we need to take and the policy framework around it within the COP system, around averting loss and damage, around minimizing loss and damage, and around addressing loss and damage. So you can think of these also in terms of things that are avoidable. So it's useful to think about building a seawall, the classic infrastructure response. There is in some cases there's potential to build a seawall to avoid all the losses and damages. In some cases there's unavoided damages, so there's a potential to build that wall, but perhaps not the technical and financial capacity to do so. And there's unavoidable, where the seawall's inappropriate, not feasible, and there's some loss and damage will be expected. And that kind of maps onto this idea of averting, minimizing, and addressing, also in terms of where we place our policy response. So I'm going to put up a nice diagram that just shares these a little bit, and mapping that if we're looking at averting and minimizing, that's tended to be predominantly where the adaptation and mitigation space is on the left of this diagram, tackling the avoidable losses and damages. Those that haven't been avoided is where they kind of more address and minimize, and particularly that addressing is become where the real policy bottleneck has been within the UNFCCC context. So that address has often been, it's not always, but often around the post, the after event. What do we do after losses and damages have been occurred? And it's tied up, of course, in the international policy architecture with questions of liability and compensation, because we're looking at damages caused by a certain set of people in a certain set of places and in certain times, with different people, different places and different times, and therefore it's bound up in justice and rights. And that's long been the ethical basis of climate change discussions around, knowingly emitting and causing harm to the global climate system, and that having consequences for others in distant places, times, and lands. In the context of the COP process, since loss and damage emerged in the early 2010s, the focus has been much more on the averting and minimizing. So there's been a lot of attention on how can we ensure that we address loss and damage, or minimize and avert loss and damage through better mitigation. So driving net zero targets, bending the emissions curve globally, and through improvements to adaptation and our risk reduction practices. So where the bottleneck now is, okay, the demand from the climate justice movement and from the G77 is we've got to start thinking about the addressing question, and that requires international transfers of finance. That's where the bottleneck was at Glasgow. It was kind of kicked down the line, but the pressure has built significantly, and that's where we're going to see a lot of pressure. So how do we establish financial mechanisms, or can we establish financial mechanisms within the COP process? The resistance to that historically has been dominated by the concerns about legal liability. So you'll see the major emitting countries, particularly the US, always branded because they always have the biggest legal team. But it's also interesting to see other large emitting countries that include members of the G20, you know, India and China, aware of the significance of their contribution to global emissions historically, as well as the richer countries of the OECD, all resisting this from a legal and compensation perspective, but at the same time recognizing that it's bound up with the same ethical debates and underpinnings of their own negotiating positions as members of the G77 and China and the non-Annex 1 block of countries in the UNFCCC. But it's also worth considering that there has been resistance, not just saying, no, can't do that because it's too dangerous from a liability perspective, but also pushback around, okay, well, what would we finance? What would be financed under this, and how would it be financed? Because if you think of the international mechanisms that already exist around addressing losses and damages, we already have an international system on insurance. We have a humanitarian system, albeit that we acknowledge they aren't picking up the losses and damages and the suffering that's caused as a result. They are suboptimal systems, but there's been resistance to say, okay, well, let's set something up under the UNFCCC system because it will replicate or duplicate the existing systems that are there, and should we be looking to those systems instead to tackle these problems? So then, what prospect for COP27? Well, the first
Tom,
prospect
you have
is
had 10 minutes.
Super. First prospect then, getting it on the agenda. There isn't an agenda item to discuss these financing options at the moment, only to discuss the Warsaw mechanism and Santiago network, which are more about kind of knowledge sharing, technical assistance responses. So in terms of the potential outcomes that we might see from COP27, there is a no agenda item. These financing things don't get discussed formally, and we may see that will be the initial pressure point in the meeting starting next week. If there's a refusal to actually have an agenda item that addressing loss and damage and the financing mechanism, there may be a walkout. We've seen that in the past by the smaller countries who are within the G77, who see this as central to their work, particularly the small island states. Probably the most likely option is that there is agreement, there is some movement, and there's a process is established to examine the options for financing. That's the kind of kicking the can down the road, but admitting that financing has to be put, that some mechanism needs to be set up. That's again suboptimal for many of the small island states, and the G77 might not accept that as an outcome. What they're looking for is an agreement that there will be a financing mechanism, and the discussion and process. So in principle, yes, they agree to a mechanism, and that the process is then to actually set up, decide what form that should take. One option is to open a financing window within the Green Climate Fund. You have an international fund that's already set up. It has, international governance with predominant control on the board by G77 non-Annex 1 countries. But it's likely that will be resisted by those smaller countries because of the difficulties they've had in accessing that finance, the convoluted ways and difficulties of getting access to GCF finance, the delays involved. So the question is, what would be a better option that has faster, more agile financing, and also moves beyond just standard grant financing through public, international public finance. And as Andy mentioned, the Bridgetown agenda and the movement of how can we link the innovations and the proposals being put forward around climate finance that is based around debt, around improving fiscal space. So think of small islands who've been hit by an extreme weather event. How can we ensure that the international financial system can pull together the ability to unlock the fiscal space for them to be able to cope with that, instead of moving into cycles of debt and an inability to then recover in ways that put them in a better position for future. So that's probably something to look out for, that if we do get this an agreement, to what extent it's going to actually look beyond conventional international public finance and link to these more innovative mechanisms. Unlikely that'll be agreed at this COP, but there may be space in there if there is agreement. That I think it's still optimistic that there's agreement that there should be a mechanism under the UNFCCC, and it'll more likely just be exploring and a process, if anything at all. But I think that's the space to look, is looking beyond the standard grant-based international finance. Leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And that was interesting to hear about the loss and damage component of climate change. And there are for sure some climate justice and equity issues that have to be taken into consideration with the loss and damage as well. And also financing different options is to find mechanisms that can include these issues. Is also important to finance loss and damage as well. But thank you to the three speakers, Andy, Jessica, and Tom, for your stimulating contribution today. And now we have approximately 50 minutes for discussion. And so I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience, from people joining this session today. And you can ask questions by raising your hands in Teams or typing them in the chat area, and I will read them for the speakers. Please also identify your name and affiliation when you ask questions to the speakers. And so I'm gonna wait if there is some questions from the audience. Otherwise, I can start the conversation as well. Or if Tom and Andy and Jessica, if you would like to add something else.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting from Jessica's point of view, if there's, I think there's a concern that because the Sharm conference isn't at a major point within the cycle of decisions under the COP, that there's a lot of momentum and excitement about it because climate change has become such a big issue. And in part, as Jessica points out, the private sector has just piled in at such magnitude in the past couple of years that it's kind of overwhelming as a policy arena, and it's become, you know, a place where those people can exchange and promote themselves. But actually, is there a potential that the COP doesn't come out with anything particularly groundbreaking, that it doesn't bend that emissions curve? We've seen that the recent report on the emissions gap, as Andy points out, suggests that we aren't, you know, we don't have a credible path currently to a 1.5 degree limit to our temperature rise. So I'd be interested to hear from that kind of net zero-y and particularly that private sector perspective, from Jessica's work before the COP, if that's possible, that we actually just don't see a lot of change, and it's just kind of business as usual COP.
I mean, thanks, Tom. It is a risk, but I mean, having private sector support climate action was one of the wins of the Paris Agreement and everything that's happened since. And so it is a good thing, but also there's a very significant risk that countries will leave it to to their private sector to do what they could do. I mean, we're seeing a lot of businesses make commitments and begin, to a very small extent, begin to do, to make progress, even in places where there's very limited regulation, particularly relating to net zero. Although someone could argue that there's other enabling conditions that are sufficient for businesses to reduce their emissions. And so in this case, I think, yeah, I'm quite excited that we have businesses taking up the role, but then we also need to recognize that COP negotiations are spaces where both different sets of actors do sit down and talk about what they do. And I think governments, particularly governments, need to step up and actually show that they have, they're taking the lead in climate action, both within the domestic spaces, but also internationally. Without that, I think we'll just kind of, it's, the same fears that we'll still have a COP that does not say much. And the risk has, I think, the likelihood of that is because the world has been excited about emission reductions for a long time. And the African COP is expected to focus on not emission reductions. And so an African COP, for example, the first few days are focusing on financing and adaptation. And so those are priorities for the African continent, and not just the continent, most other developing countries. And so it's kind of changing the narrative a bit, saying that climate action is not just emission reductions that has taken space, taken the center stage for the past 2 or 3 COPs, but in this case, it's saying that we need more financing. We need to kind of map a clear pathway for how we're going to fund adaptation, how we're going to implement adaptation. And so there's a likelihood that there will be conflicts, at the COP where people come and say, we want to talk about mitigation, but then people are like, no, this time around, let's talk about adaptation and loss and damage and finance. And so with that, we might just end up having a COP that does not say much, but also it could also be quite a good thing, because a continent, but also a group taking a stand and saying that we talk about this because this is the time to talk about it, means that we could have very good outcomes on what we do for adaptation, but also how we implement adaptation. At least based on my experience, it's quite important that we talk about how do we, because countries do have a lot of plans. There's an LSC database that shows how many climate change, I think, climate laws and policies of the world, it's a lot. Countries do have a lot of policies, but I think there's need to see how we can translate that into action, because in this case, then otherwise we'll still get to 2030 and we're still thinking about how do we implement the policies we created in 2016 or 2020.
Thank you, Jessica. We have a question in the chat from Anjum. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. And a graduate student at SOAS and the policy consultant in Bangladesh. And the question is wondering what's needed in terms of negotiation and institutional capacity for developing countries to secure country-appropriate climate financing. I think both Andy and Tom, maybe you can. Andy?
Yeah, thanks very much, Giuseppina. I mean, this is a huge issue, and the track record of the GCF in terms of particularly adaptation bids, particularly from low-income countries or LDCs, isn't great. And there is a real issue there around the demands of the process and the capacity to be able to engage with that. So I think there's obviously a need to build capacity, but equally there's a need to make the access procedures less demanding, and to particularly, I think, at the in the adaptation space, to kind of deal with some of the issues that have come up at the GCF board, where there's been a reluctance to recognise sort of general resilience building actions as legitimate climate finance, and that needs to change too. So I think it's a mix of making the procedures slimmer and easier for LDCs to access and SIDS and so on, and also building capacity as well. Tom.
Yeah, I just add that that fight, I think that struggle to amongst the poorer countries extends in particular to the fragile and conflict affected states and their ability to access financing, and particularly not just around the capacity to develop the proposal documents in the right format, but actually to pitch and say, this is actually what we need for adaptation in this country, is the baseline for adaptive capacity. You know, if you're coming out from situations of conflict, as Jessica pointed out, you have that low baseline to say, this isn't like a pure adaptation project that is about, you know, building a sea defense to a specific hazard. It's that we haven't got the basis for our weather forecasting, our planning systems, you know, making the population healthy, wealthy, wise, well-governed, the things we know help us adapt to more broadly and be more resilient to a wider range of shocks and stresses, and to have that kind of systemic risk management approach rather than only focusing on climate. But making that case where there are scarce climate finance resources is very difficult. And there's been resistant in the Green Climate Fund in particular to funding those kind of interventions because they're seen as development finance. But actually, for many countries, that case really has to be made stronger. I think that's something where there needs to be more engagement by the international NGOs to put and to lobby and put pressure on the GCF. The conditions for the low-income countries and particularly the fragile and conflict-affected states do need to be different, and that adaptation finance and loss and damage finance looks different in those countries.
Thank you, Tom. Andy. Jessica, would you like to add something else, or we can move to the next question? We have another question in the chat from a student in global energy and climate policy from SOAS. And the question is a concern with green energy financing. And the question is, has there been the formulation of more transparent and credible reporting modalities for donor and receiver nations under the COP process? And this is related to what can be classified as green finance and how to track the total amount of money being deployed, especially for the accelerating conversations around loss and damage funding. So this is a question for maybe Tom and Jessica, or Tom, do you want to start with the loss and damage component of the question?
It's just it's extremely contested. What should count as your contribution? So obviously the 100 billion target was around catalyzing that amount. So this discrepancy between, well, the governments of the OECD countries haven't put forward this much money, and then their argument is, well, we've leveraged this, you know, catalyzed further levels of funding, and that's easier to at least make a case for when you're looking at green energy finance, for example, and working with strong private sector networks where you can demonstrate more easily that impact pathway of catalyzing further finance and unblocking risks to market participation than in adaptation and impacts side. So yes, that will be extremely difficult. There is a resistance within the post-Paris framework to set up these really stringent rules and rule books in a way that there was pre-Paris, partly because the Paris Agreement was about moving to a more voluntary approach and to make sure you're crowding everyone in rather than crowding certain people out. So yeah, that's not encouraging, I know, but I think the potential to crowd in probably has outweighed the problems of not having perfect tracking systems, in my view, at least. And that might be the case as well for crowding in what Salim has referred to as solidarity finance. So if we think of loss and damage financing as not just being about governments putting their hand in their pocket, but individuals, about companies, and that having loose rules for that on the basis of global solidarity may actually help raise more money for a fund than if you had, you know, targets that each country on the basis of responsibility has to pledge this amount of money, which is likely to, you know, have significant resistance and may end up with a smaller pot.
Thank you, Tom. Andy and Jessica, would you like to add something to this, or we can move to the next question? Okay. We have another question from Sean, a student from Jamaica, the University of Galway. So the question is, how do we solve circumstances in which affluent nations are ready to pay climate-related losses and damages, but they are reluctant to make the necessary adjustment to reduce emissions in their industrialized societies? In question.
I can give that a go. I think it's the other way around, actually. So with net zero, you know, countries are saying we will do a lot of things by 2050. We will change the world. But then, so they say that they will make changes in their emissions, but they're not really, you know, they're not willing to pay for losses and damages. And that is one of the concerns that we have with the net zero framework itself. It's just so forward-looking, so far off that, you know, companies and countries can say they will do things without really identifying what happens in between. And so, you know, we've looked at plans, commitments by, you know, different groups that do not say what happens between now and 2050 or 2060 when a target is achieved, but also what resources will these entities need? Where do those resources come from? There's really not much clarity, and so it kind of feels like countries are just, you know, kicking the ball down the road and expecting that when they'll get to 2040 or 2050, then things will just have fallen in place and then they'll be able to reduce their emissions. But then, and at least in my opinion, I say this as a way of avoiding losses and damages, because we've normalized a future where 1.5 is okay. So we're working towards 1.5, you know what it means, and so you're okay with that. And so let's just keep working towards that.
Thank you, Jessica. I think
I wonder if it's Sean's. He's thinking of you know, high emitting fossil fuel dominated economies who are rich enough to say, well, we will pay compensation, but we'll also still keep emitting. So, you know, happy to put money into funds, but need to keep emitting, at least, even if they're thinking about transition to a low carbon future. Yeah, it's a good question. There's an ethical issue, I guess, about being able to buy yourself out of the pollution, the damage you're causing, and that's a little bit like the offsets arguments that have been made in the past, that, you know, rich people just buying themselves out of the problem and buying themselves out of their moral obligation as well. I'm not sure we have an answer for how that's to be avoided, other than to ensure that everyone is part of solutions across the pillars of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So it's not an either or, but actually the idea is to crowd everyone into the process of setting net zero targets, working towards reducing emissions at the same time as assisting with international impacts.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Serena Tan. She's a postgraduate student in global energy and climate policy at SOAS. And the question is, I wonder how this COP27 will address the climate finance into implementation, in particular the concerns of overdue $100 billion pledge to realization, now extended to 2023. And the other question is, what are the main barriers for developed countries in setting up a transparent process in place to monitor its development? Andy?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for the question. I think there is progress being made on the transparency of climate finance flows, but it's slow. And that the level of transparency is really inadequate at this point. So I think the main barriers, to be honest, are sort of general political economy barriers. As Tom was saying, Paris was set up with a huge amount of discretion in relation to how countries took any kind of climate action. And there's still, I think, there's still a way to go on the climate finance side in terms of having clearer and more transparent frameworks which are consistent between donors. So yeah, I think the barriers mainly are in the area of national political economy. I think progress is being made and will continue to be made, but maybe not as fast as you'd ideally want.
Thank you, Andy. Any other comments from the speakers?
One more.
Yeah.
Can I just?
Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, can I just ask Tom a question, which is on the role of climate litigation and in relation to loss and damage. We have various initiatives out there that clearly imply sort of payments for loss and damage, both with reference to companies and countries. Is this considered within the general scope of what people will be discussing at COP27 on loss and damage, or is that really a separate kind of space?
No, it's not. I mean, there's the discussions around addressing loss and damage have essentially consistently blocked by the larger emitting countries. I think their lawyers are on their backs, and their lawyers are probably conscious of probably have the major company lawyers on their backs. So no, not to date, to my knowledge.
Thank you. It's 2 p.m. and so this session was supposed to last for 1 hour, and we are at the end of the discussion today. And if there are any more comments from the speakers, otherwise I think we can close the session. And but before, I would like to thank you all for being here today and for the very stimulating discussions we had on COP27, but also many different issues, climate justice and equity and green finance. I think that was very, very interesting. And also ahead of COP27 next in a few days, I mean, next week. So I hope you enjoyed it, and please get in touch if you have any further questions, and have a good rest of the day. And thank you very much to the speakers for your contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.